It was a bright, sunny Saturday morning in the quiet little neighborhood called Pinewood Lane. The sun was shining high in the sky, making everything look happy and warm. Birds were chirping their little songs, hopping from tree to tree. Kids were running around, laughing and playing games like tag and hide and seek. The air smelled like fresh grass and flowers, and it felt like the perfect day to be outside. Me. I was in my backyard, working on something simple but important, a new fence. It wasn't a big, fancy fence or anything like that. Just some plain wooden planks I wanted to put up so my silly dog, Buster, would stop running off after squirrels. Buster's a good dog, but he loves chasing those fuzzy little critters, and I didn't want him getting lost all the way in the next county. I had my hammer in one hand and a pile of nails in the other. The wood planks were leaning against my old shed, waiting for me to get started. I was excited because I'd been planning this fence for weeks. I even measured everything super carefully to make sure it was just right. Buster was sitting nearby, wagging his tail and watching me with his big, goofy eyes. Everything felt peaceful, like nothing could go wrong. But oh boy, was I wrong about that. Little did I know, someone was watching me from across the street. Not just watching, they were staring at me like a hawk looking at its next meal. And that someone? She was about to turn my nice, quiet day into something wild and crazy. Her name was Karen. Yep, that kind of Karen. If you don't know what I mean, let me paint you a picture. Karen wasn't just any neighbor, she was the bossy, loud, I am in charge here type of person. She had a haircut that looked like a megaphone, all short and spiky, like it was yelling at you before she even opened her mouth. She always wore big sunglasses perched on top of her head, even when it wasn't sunny. And her voice? Oh man, it was so loud it could wake up someone who'd been asleep for 100 years. Karen wasn't just any old loud lady, though. She was the queen of our homeowners association, or HOA for short. The HOA is this group that makes rules for our neighborhood, like how tall your grass can be or what color your house can be painted. And Karen? She loved those rules more than anything. She carried a clipboard everywhere, writing down every little thing she didn't like. To her, Pinewood Lane was her own little kingdom, and she was the ruler who told everyone what to do. Most people in the neighborhood were scared of Karen. They'd see her coming with that clipboard and her sharp eyes, and they'd run inside or pretend to be busy. If your trash can was out too long or your mailbox looked a tiny bit crooked, Karen would knock on your door and give you a big lecture. She'd say stuff like, "This is unacceptable," or "You're ruining our perfect street." Everyone just tiptoed around her, trying not to make her mad. Nobody wanted to be on her bad side because she could make your life miserable with her rules and her complaining. But me? I wasn't trying to fight with anybody. I didn't care about Karen or her clipboard or her kingdom. All I wanted was to build my fence, keep Buster safe, and enjoy my Saturday. That's it? Simple, right? Well, not for long. See, I'd moved into Pinewood Lane a few months ago. It was a nice place, small houses with neat yards, friendly people, and lots of trees. I liked it because it felt cozy and calm. I'm not a loud guy or someone who makes trouble. I just like hanging out with Buster, fixing up my house, and keeping things easy. When I decided to build the fence, I didn't think it would be a big deal. I mean, it's just a fence. I even went to the city office and asked if it was okay. They gave me a little paper that said I could build it as long as it wasn't too tall. I measured everything twice 6 feet high, just like the rules said. I thought I was all set. But Karen didn't care about that. To her, anything new was a problem, and I was about to find out just how much she hated problems. That morning, I was humming a little tune to myself as I started hammering the first plank into the ground. Bang, bang, bang. The sound echoed a little, but it wasn't loud enough to bother anyone, or so I thought. Buster was sniffing around the yard, chasing a butterfly now instead of a squirrel. I smiled at him and kept working. The sun felt warm on my back, and I was thinking about how nice it would be to sit on my porch later with a cold drink, looking at my finished fence. It was going to be a good day. Or at least, it should have been a good day. But then I heard it clip-clop, clip-clop. The sound of flip-flops slapping against the sidewalk. My heart sank a little. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was. I peeked over my shoulder, and there she was, Karen, marching toward me like she was on a mission. Her sunglasses were glinting in the sunlight, and her clipboard was tucked under her arm like a weapon. She had this look on her face, all scrunched up and angry, like she'd just smelled something bad. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. Maybe she was just walking by. Maybe she'd leave me alone. But nope, Karen stopped right at the edge of my yard, put her hands on her hips, and stared at me. I could feel her eyes burning into me, like she was trying to figure out what I was up to. I kept hammering, pretending I didn't notice her, but my stomach started to twist. I had a feeling this wasn't going to be quick or easy. "Hey! You," she shouted, her voice cutting through the air like a siren. I stopped hammering and turned around slowly. "Hi, Karen," I said, trying to sound friendly. "What's up?" She didn't say hi back. Instead, she pointed at my fence like it was a monster. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "That fence is 3 inches too tall. It's against HOA rules, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." I blinked at her. 3 inches. I'd measured it a million times. It was 6 feet, exactly what the city said was okay. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice nice and steady, "it's not too tall. I checked with the city. It's fine." "Big mistake." You should have seen her face. It turned bright red, like a fire truck. "Don't you dare talk back to me," she yelled, waving her finger in my face. "I've been running this neighborhood for 10 years, and I know a rule breaker when I see one." I just stood there, holding my hammer, wondering how this lady could get so mad about a fence. She pulled out her phone and started tapping on it, muttering something about teaching me a lesson. I didn't know it yet, but she was about to call 911. Yep, the actual police over my little wooden fence. And that's when things got really interesting. But here's the thing, Karen thought she was the smartest person on Pinewood Lane. She thought she could yell and boss everyone around, and we'd all just listen. She didn't know I'd done my homework. She didn't know I was ready for her. And most importantly, she didn't know something big was already waiting for her, something way worse than a fence. So, let me ask you this, have you ever met someone who thinks they're in charge of everything? Maybe a teacher, a bossy kid at school, or even a neighbor like Karen. Stick around, because this story's just getting started, and Karen's about to learn a lesson she'll never forget. I stood there in my backyard, hammer still in my hand, watching Karen freak out about my fence. The sun was still shining, the birds were still singing, but now it felt like a storm was brewing and Karen was the thunder. Buster trotted over to me, tilting his head like he was confused too. I gave him a little pat on the head and whispered, "Don't worry, buddy. She's just loud." But inside, I was starting to wonder how this was going to end. I didn't want trouble. I just wanted my fence. Karen kept pacing back and forth in front of my yard, talking to herself like she was planning something big. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "People can't just do whatever they want around here." She glared at me again, her eyes narrow and sharp. "You think you're so smart, huh? Building that ugly thing without asking me first." I wanted to tell her I didn't need to ask her, I'd ask the city, and they said yes. But I figured that would just make her madder, so I kept my mouth shut. Sometimes it's better to let people yell themselves out, you know? The neighborhood was starting to notice. I saw curtains twitch in the house next door. Old Mr. Jenkins, who lived across the street, poked his head out his front door and squinted at us. A couple of kids riding bikes slowed down, staring at Karen like she was a circus act. She didn't care, though. She was too busy being the star of her own show. "I'll fix this," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll make sure this fence comes down, one way or another." Then she held up her phone like it was a trophy and started dialing. I couldn't believe it. Was she really calling someone about my fence? I mean, it's just wood and nails. I leaned against one of my fence posts and crossed my arms, waiting to see what she'd do. Buster sat down next to me, his tongue hanging out, looking happy as ever. Karen pressed the phone to her ear and started talking fast. "Yes, hello, this is an emergency," she said, her voice all dramatic. "There's a man here building an illegal structure in my neighborhood. He's breaking all the rules, and I need someone to stop him right now." My jaw dropped. An emergency? Illegal structure? I almost laughed, but I didn't want to poke the bear or the Karen, I guess. She kept going, waving her free hand around like she was on a stage. "He's trespassing on HOA property, and it's dangerous. Send someone quick. I shook my head. Trespassing. Dangerous. It was my backyard, and the only danger was Buster tripping over a stick. But Karen was on a roll, and there was no stopping her now. While she was busy yelling into her phone, I started thinking about how I ended up here. When I moved to Pinewood Lane, I thought it would be peaceful. The houses were cute, with little porches and flower boxes. The street was lined with big pine trees that made everything smell fresh. My house wasn't huge, but it had a nice backyard for Buster and a spot where I could sit and relax. I liked my neighbors, most of them, anyway. Mr. Jenkins was grumpy but harmless. The family next door had a little girl who'd wave at me every morning. It was a good place to live. Or at least, it was until Karen decided I was her new enemy. I'd heard stories about her before. The guy who sold me the house warned me. "Watch out for the HOA lady," he'd said with a laugh. "She's tough." I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured I'd just follow the rules and stay out of her way. But now, standing here with my half-built fence and a Karen on the warpath, I realized staying out of her way wasn't an option. She'd find you no matter what. And today, I was the one she'd found. The funny thing is, I wasn't even mad yet. Annoyed. Sure. Confused. Definitely. But I wasn't mad. I kept telling myself, she'll tire herself out. The police won't care about a fence. I mean, they've got bigger stuff to deal with, right? Robbers, lost pets, actual emergencies, not some lady mad about 3 inches of wood. So I waited, leaning on my fence post, watching Karen put on her big performance. The kids on bikes were giggling now, and Mr. Jenkins was still staring from his porch. It was like the whole street was holding its breath, waiting to see what happened next. Karen hung up the phone and turned to me with a smug little smile. "They're on their way," she said, like she'd just won a prize. "You're in big trouble now, mister. The police don't mess around with people like you." I raised an eyebrow. "People like me?" I asked. "Yeah," she snapped. "Rule breakers. Troublemakers. You think you can just move in here and do whatever you want? Not on my watch." I sighed. "Karen, it's a fence. It's not hurting anybody." But she didn't listen. She never listened. She just turned away and started writing something on her clipboard, probably a list of all the ways I was ruining the neighborhood. I looked down at Buster, who was now rolling in the grass, totally clueless about the drama. "At least you're having a good day," I muttered to him. He barked once, like he was agreeing with me. But here's where it gets sneaky. While Karen was busy acting like the queen of everything, I remembered something important. See, I'm not the kind of guy who just builds stuff without checking. Before I even bought the wood for my fence, I went to the city office downtown. It's this boring gray building with lots of desks and papers. I waited in line for like an hour, then talked to a nice lady named Mrs. Carter. She wore glasses and had a big smile. I told her about my fence idea, and she pulled out a rule book. 6 feet tall is fine, she said, stamping a paper for me. "Just don't block the sidewalk or anything crazy." I thanked her, took my paper, and went home happy. That paper was sitting in my kitchen right now, proof that my fence was okay. Karen didn't know about that paper. She didn't know I'd checked the rules, real rules, not just her HOA stuff. And she definitely didn't know something else I'd noticed earlier that morning. See, when I was getting my tools out of the shed, I'd seen a police car parked down the street. It was just sitting there, quiet, with 2 officers inside. I didn't think much of it at the time, maybe they were taking a break or something. But now, with Karen calling 911 and acting all high and mighty, I started to wonder. Why were they already here? What were they waiting for? My brain was buzzing with questions, but I didn't say anything. I just watched Karen, keeping my little secrets to myself. So, picture this, I'm standing in my yard, hammer in hand, with Buster rolling around like a goofball. Karen's pacing and bragging about how the cops are coming to get me. The neighbors are peeking out, whispering to each other. And down the street, that police car is still there, quiet and mysterious. It's like a puzzle, and I'm starting to think I've got a piece Karen doesn't even know exists. She thinks she's got me cornered, but maybe, just maybe, I'm not the one who should be worried. Let me ask you again, have you ever met someone who thinks they're in charge of everything? Maybe they boss you around at school or tell you what to do at home. Karen was that person for Pinewood Lane. She thought she could snap her fingers and make everyone jump. But this time, she picked the wrong guy and the wrong fence. Stick with me, because this story's about to get wild, and Karen's in for a surprise she'll never see coming. Here I was, standing in my backyard on a sunny Saturday morning, ready to build a little fence for my dog, Buster. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and everything felt just right. I had my hammer in one hand and a shiny nail in the other. I lined up the nail with the wood, gave it a big bang, and smiled. One nail down, a bunch more to go. My fence was going to be perfect, nothing fancy, just some wooden planks to keep Buster from chasing squirrels all over the place. But then, just as I was about to hit the next nail, I heard it clip-clop, clip-clop. It was the sound of flip-flops stomping down the sidewalk, fast and loud. My stomach did a little flip. I had a bad feeling about this. I looked up, and there she was, Karen. She wasn't just walking, she was marching, like she was on a mission to catch a bad guy. Her flip-flop slapped the ground with every step, and her face was all scrunched up like she'd just bitten into a sour lemon. "Hey! You," she barked, pointing her finger at me like I'd just robbed a bank or something crazy. I froze, hammer still in my hand, and stared at her. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the bossy queen of our homeowners association, or HOA. She made rules for everything: how tall your grass could be, what color your mailbox could be, even how loud you could laugh. Okay, maybe not that last one, but it felt like it sometimes. Everyone on Pinewood Lane was a little scared of her, and now she was coming for me. "That fence is 3 inches too tall," she yelled, waving her arms like she was trying to scare off a flock of birds. "It's against HOA rules, and I will have it torn down." Her voice was so loud I bet the squirrels in the next yard heard her. I blinked and looked at my fence. It was just one plank so far, barely even started. Then I looked back at Karen, trying to figure out what she was so mad about. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice nice and calm, "it's within the limit." I checked. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted her to see I wasn't breaking any rules. I'd gone to the city office and everything they said 6 feet was okay, and my fence was exactly 6 feet. I thought that would make her chill out. Oh boy, was I wrong. That was a big mistake. Her face turned red, redder than a ripe tomato sitting in the sun. Her eyes got all big and wild, and she took a step closer to me. "Don't you dare talk back to me," she snapped, her voice sharp like a teacher scolding a kid who forgot their homework. "I've been running this neighborhood for 10 years, and I know a rule breaker when I see one." She said it like she was the smartest person ever, like she had a superpower for spotting trouble. I didn't feel like a rule breaker. I felt like a guy with a hammer and a dog who just wanted a quiet day. But Karen? She was acting like I'd built a giant castle in my backyard instead of a plain old fence. Before I could say anything else, she whipped out her phone from her pocket. It was one of those big, shiny phones with a sparkly case, and she held it up like it was a magic wand. She started tapping on it fast, her fingers moving like lightning. Then she put it to her ear and started talking, well, yelling, "Really? Hello? Yes, this is an emergency," she shouted into the phone. "There's a dangerous trespasser here building an illegal structure in my neighborhood." My jaw dropped. Dangerous? Trespasser? Illegal? I looked around my yard. It was just me, Buster, and a pile of wood. I wasn't hurting anybody. But Karen kept going, her voice getting louder and louder. "He's breaking all the rules, and I need someone to come stop him right now." I just stood there, hammer still in my hand, staring at her. Buster tilted his head, his floppy ears perking up like he was confused too. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was calling 911, the actual police, over my fence. My little wooden fence that wasn't even finished yet. I wondered how my Saturday had turned into this. One minute I'm hammering nails, dreaming about sitting on my porch with a cold lemonade, and the next minute Karen's treating me like some big criminal. It was nuts. But here's the thing: she didn't know something important. I wasn't just some guy who threw up a fence without thinking. I'd done my homework. A few weeks ago, I'd gone to the city office, a boring building with gray walls and lots of papers everywhere. I waited in line, talked to a nice lady named Mrs. Carter, and showed her my fence plan. She checked her big rule book and said, 6 feet is fine. You're good to go. She even gave me a paper with a stamp on it, like a golden ticket that said I could build my fence. That paper was sitting on my kitchen table right now, safe and sound. I thought it would keep me out of trouble. But Karen? She didn't care about city rules. She only cared about her rules, the ones she made up for the HOA. And here's something even sneakier: she really didn't know what was about to happen next. See, while Karen was yelling and waving her phone around, I started to notice something strange. Down the street, half hidden by some trees, there was a police car. It wasn't moving or making any noise, just sitting there, quiet as a mouse. I'd seen it earlier when I was getting my tools out, but I didn't think much of it. Police cars drive around sometimes, right? No big deal. But now, with Karen calling 911 and acting like she'd caught a bank robber, I started to wonder. Why were they already here? What were they waiting for? My brain was buzzing with questions, but I didn't say a word. I just watched her, keeping my secrets to myself. Karen hung up the phone and turned to me with a big, smug smile. "They're coming," she said, crossing her arms like she'd just won a game. "The police are on their way, and you're in big trouble now." She sounded so sure of herself, like she'd already decided I was guilty. I tilted my head and looked at her. "Karen," I said, still trying to be nice, "it's just a fence. It's not a big deal." But she didn't listen. She never listened. She just huffed and turned away, muttering something about teaching me a lesson. I leaned against my one little fence post and sighed. Buster trotted over and sat next to me, wagging his tail like nothing was wrong. "At least you're not mad," I whispered to him. He barked once, a happy little sound, and I scratched behind his ears. Meanwhile, Karen kept pacing back and forth in front of my yard, her flip-flops going clip-clop over and over. She was like a storm cloud, dark and loud, ruining my sunny day. I could feel my neighbors watching now. Curtains were moving in the windows, and old Mr. Jenkins across the street stuck his head out his door to stare. Even the kids on their bikes stopped riding and stood there, whispering to each other. Everyone wanted to see what Karen would do next. I tried to stay calm. I told myself, she's just loud. The police won't care about a fence. I mean, they've got real stuff to do: catching bad guys, helping lost pets, keeping people safe. A fence wasn't going to make them rush over with sirens blaring. Right? But Karen was acting like this was the crime of the century. She kept talking to herself, saying stuff like, "This is why I'm in charge. People can't just do whatever they want." She pointed at my fence again, even though it was still just one plank nailed to a post. "That thing is an eyesore," she shouted. "It's ruining our perfect neighborhood." I looked at my fence. It didn't look bad to me. It was just wood, plain, brown wood that matched my shed. How could one plank ruin a whole neighborhood? But to Karen, it was like I'd painted my house purple or parked a broken car in the yard. She saw rules being broken, and that made her madder than a cat in a bathtub. I wanted to tell her again that I'd checked with the city, that I had proof my fence was okay. But every time I opened my mouth, she got louder, so I stopped trying. I figured I'd just wait and see what happened when the police got here, if they even came. The air felt heavy now, like something big was about to happen. Karen's yelling had turned my quiet morning into a big mess, and I didn't know how to fix it. I wasn't scared, though not yet. I was mostly annoyed. I'd planned a nice day with Buster, hammering nails and maybe grilling some hot dogs later. Now I was stuck dealing with a lady who thought a fence was the end of the world. I glanced down the street again, at that police car still sitting there. It hadn't moved an inch. The officers inside were just shadows behind the windows, watching or waiting, I couldn't tell. It was weird, and it made me wonder if maybe this wasn't just about my fence after all. Karen didn't notice the car. She was too busy stomping around, her flip-flops making that clip-clop sound that was starting to drive me crazy. She pulled out her clipboard from under her arm and started writing something, her pen scratching fast across the paper. "I'm documenting this," she said, not even looking at me. "Every little thing you've done wrong. The police will see this, and they'll know I'm right." I rolled my eyes. What was she writing? "Man with hammer builds fence. Dog sits in yard." It was silly, but she acted like it was super important. I started thinking about all the stories I'd heard about Karen. My neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, told me once that Karen fined her for having a flower pot that was too bright. Mr. Jenkins said she yelled at him because his trash can was out 5 minutes past pickup time. Everyone had a Karen story, and they all ended the same way, with her thinking she was the boss of everything. I guess I was the new kid on the block, so it was my turn to get the Karen treatment. Lucky me. But while she was scribbling on her clipboard, I kept my cool. I had that paper from the city, and I knew my fence was fine. Karen could yell all she wanted, but she couldn't change the rules, the real rules. And that police car down the street? It was like a little mystery sitting there, making me wonder what was really going on. Karen thought she was winning, but I had a feeling she was about to lose, and lose big. She didn't know it yet, but the trouble she was stirring up wasn't going to land on me. It was going to come right back to her. So there I stood, hammer in hand, with Buster by my side and Karen in my face. The tension was building, like the air before a thunderstorm. She thought she had me trapped, like a mouse in a cage. But I wasn't trapped. I was waiting. Waiting for her to figure out she'd picked the wrong fight. Waiting for whatever was coming next. And deep down, I had this sneaky little thought, Karen's loud, but she's not as smart as she thinks. The police were on their way, or maybe they were already here, and the Saturday was about to get a whole lot wilder. Karen was still pacing in front of my yard, her flip-flops going clip-clop like a horse trotting down the street. She waved her phone around, then her clipboard, then her phone again, like she couldn't decide which one was her weapon. "You're going to regret this," she shouted at me, her voice so loud it bounced off my house. "The police will be here any minute, and they'll rip that fence down faster than you can blink." I didn't say anything. I just watched her, leaning on my fence post like it was no big deal. Buster rolled over in the grass, showing his belly to the sun, totally happy, while Karen lost her mind. I glanced at my fence again, just one plank nailed to a post, sticking up like a lonely tree. It didn't look dangerous or illegal to me. It looked like the start of something good, something to keep Buster safe. But Karen saw it like it was a giant sign saying, "I don't care about your rules." She kept yelling, her words tumbling out like a waterfall. "I've worked hard to keep this neighborhood perfect," she said. 10 years of making sure everything's just right, and then you show up, thinking you can build whatever you want." She pointed at me again, her finger shaking a little. "You're a troublemaker, and I'm not letting you get away with it." I scratched my head with the hammer handle, trying not to laugh. Troublemaker? Me? I'm the guy who waves at everybody and picks up litter when I see it. I don't even play loud music. But Karen didn't care about that. To her, I was the bad guy in her little story, and she was the hero who'd save the day. I wanted to tell her, "Lady, it's a fence, not a monster." But I kept quiet. Talking back had already made her mad once. I wasn't going to poke that beehive again. The neighbors were really watching now. Mrs. Lopez next door peeked out her kitchen window, her eyes big and curious. Mr. Jenkins shuffled onto his porch, leaning on his cane and squinting at us. The kids on bikes rolled closer, whispering and giggling like this was the best show they'd seen all week. One of them, a little boy with messy hair, pointed at Karen and said, "She's yelling again." His friend laughed and nodded. I couldn't blame them. Karen was loud enough to wake up the whole street. She didn't notice the audience. She was too busy marching back and forth, her flip-flops slapping the ground harder with every step. Clip-clop, clip-clop, clip-clop. It was like a beat you could dance to, if you weren't so annoyed by it. She stopped for a second, looked at her phone, and then smirked at me. "They're almost here," she said, her voice all proud. "The police don't mess around. You'll see." I shrugged. "Okay, Karen," I said, keeping it simple. I didn't know what else to say. She was so sure she was right, but I had that paper from the city in my kitchen. I wasn't worried, well, not too much. Buster barked again, a happy little yip, and started chasing his tail in circles. I smiled at him. "You're no help," I said quietly, but I was glad he was there. He made everything feel a little less crazy. Karen glared at Buster like he was part of my evil plan. "And that dog," she snapped. "He's probably why you're building this thing, running around, making a mess." I looked at Buster, spinning in the grass like a goofy tornado. "Yeah," I said, "he's a real criminal." I was kidding, but Karen didn't laugh. She just huffed and wrote something else on her clipboard. I started thinking about that police car again. It was still down the street, parked under a big pine tree. The sun was bouncing off its windows, so I couldn't see inside, but it hadn't moved at all. Why was it there? Had someone else called the cops? Was something else going on? My brain was spinning with ideas, but I didn't have any answers yet. I just kept it in my head, like a secret I wasn't ready to tell. Karen thought the police were coming because of her 911 call, but what if they were already here for something else? Something bigger? I didn't know, but it made my stomach tingle with excitement. Karen kept talking, her voice like a buzzing bee that wouldn't go away. This neighborhood used to be perfect, she said, shaking her head. Before people like you moved in, everything was neat and tidy. Now look at this mess. She waved her hand at my yard. I looked around: green grass, a few flowers, my shed, and one fence plank. Mess. Really? I didn't get it, but I wasn't surprised. Karen saw messes everywhere, even when there weren't any. It was her thing. I decided to try one more time to calm her down. Karen, I said, nice and slow, I'm not trying to mess anything up. I just want a fence for my dog. I checked with the city, and they said it's okay. Can we just leave it at that? She stopped pacing and stared at me, her mouth open like she couldn't believe what I'd said. Then she laughed a short, mean laugh. The city, she said. I don't care about the city. This is my neighborhood, and my rules matter here. She tapped her clipboard with her pen. And my rules say that fence is too tall. I sighed again. There was no winning with her. She didn't care about facts or papers or anything real. She just wanted to be the boss, and I was in her way. I looked at Buster, who was now sniffing a dandelion, and shook my head. We're in trouble, buddy, I whispered. He wagged his tail, clueless and happy. At least one of us was having a good time. The tension was thick now, like fog you could feel. Karen was a volcano ready to blow, and I was just standing there, waiting for whatever came next. She thought she had me beat. She thought the police would roll up, tear down my fence, and tell me she was right. But I wasn't so sure. That police car down the street, it was like a puzzle piece that didn't fit yet. And my paper from the city? That was my shield, even if Karen didn't know it. She was loud and mad, but I had a feeling this wasn't going to end the way she planned. Karen started pacing faster, her flip-flops going clip-clop so loud it was like a drum beat. She was muttering to herself now, saying stuff like, "This is outrageous, and I won't stand for it." I watched her, trying not to roll my eyes too hard. She looked like a cartoon character, arms flapping, face red, hair bouncing with every step. If this wasn't my yard, I might have laughed out loud. But it was my yard, and she was making my day a big headache. The kids on bikes were closer now, sitting on the curb with their chins in their hands. "She's gonna explode," one of them whispered, loud enough for me to hear. His friend giggled and nodded. "Yeah, her head's gonna pop like a balloon." I smirked a little. They weren't wrong, Karen was losing it, and it was kind of funny if you weren't the one she was mad at. Mrs. Lopez opened her window a crack and leaned out, shaking her head like she'd seen this show before. Mr. Jenkins mumbled something from his porch. I couldn't hear it, but it didn't sound happy. Karen spun around and pointed at me again. "You think this is a game?" she shouted. "You think you can just ignore me? I'm the president of the HOA. I make the rules around here." I wanted to say, "No, the city makes the rules, and I followed them." But I didn't. She was too far gone, and talking would just pour more gas on her fire. Instead, I shrugged and said, "I'm just building a fence, Karen." That was like throwing a stick at a beehive. She stomped her foot clip-clop, and yelled, "It's not just a fence. It's a violation. It's a disaster. It's ruining everything." Buster barked at her stomping, thinking it was a game. He bounced over to her, wagging his tail like he wanted to play. "Get that dog away from me," she screeched, jumping back like Buster was a lion instead of a goofy mutt. I whistled, and Buster trotted back to me, looking confused. "Sorry, bud," I said. "She's not in a playing mood." Karen glared at us both, her hands on her hips. "That dog's a menace too," she said. "Running around, barking, digging holes. I bet he's why you need that stupid fence. I patted Busta's head. He's a good boy, I said, loud enough for her to hear. He just likes squirrels. She huffed again, like that was the dumbest thing she'd ever heard. Squirrels, she muttered. This is about standards, not squirrels. I didn't know what standards had to do with my fence, but I wasn't going to ask. Karen was on a roll, and I was just along for the ride. She went back to her clipboard, scribbling like her life depended on it. I'm writing all this down, she said. The fence, the dog, the attitude, everything. The police will see what a problem you are. I peeked over, trying to see what she was writing, but she held the clipboard close, like it was a treasure map. I wondered what she'd say about me. Man with hammer ignores HOA queen? Dog wags tail too much. It was ridiculous, but she was dead serious. The sun was getting hotter now, beating down on my yard. Sweat trickled down my back, but I didn't move. I stayed by my fence post, watching Karen pace and yell. The neighbors were still there, their eyes glued to us. The kids were eating snacks now, popcorn, I think, like this was a movie. Mrs. Lopez waved at me, a little smile on her face, like she was saying, hang in there. Mr. Jenkins shook his cane at Karen, grumbling something about too much noise. I waved back at Mrs. Lopez, glad at least someone wasn't mad at me. I looked down the street again. That police car was still there, quiet and still. It was starting to feel like a character in the story, mysterious, sneaky, waiting for the right moment. Karen didn't see it. She was too busy being the loudest thing on Pinewood Lane. She thought she'd called the cops and they'd come running to help her. But what if they were already here? What if they weren't coming for me? My brain was buzzing again, and I felt a little grin tug at my lips. Karen had no idea what was waiting for her. She stopped pacing for a second and stared at me, her eyes narrow. Why are you smiling? She demanded. You think this is funny? I wiped the grin off my face quick. No, Karen, I said. Just thinking. She didn't like that. Thinking about what? She snapped. How much trouble you're in. I shrugged. Something like that. I wasn't going to tell her the truth that I was thinking about her big surprise. Let her figure it out the hard way. The tension was huge now, like a rubber band stretched tight. Karen was sure she'd won. She had her phone, her clipboard, her rules, and the police on the way, or so she thought. I had my hammer, my dog, and a little piece of paper that said I was right. And down the street, that police car sat like a secret, ready to change everything. Karen kept yelling, the neighbors kept watching, and I kept waiting. This wasn't over, not even close. Karen was stomping all over my yard now, her flip-flops going clip-clop like a mad horse. She held her phone tied to her ear, shouting so loud I bet the birds stopped singing just to listen. This guy is ruining the neighborhood, she yelled into the phone. He's building an illegal fence, and it's a total disaster. You need to send someone quick. I stood there by my little fence post, watching her go nuts. My hammer dangled in my hand, and my dog, Buster, sat next to me, wagging his tail like this was all a big game. I didn't say anything. I just let her rant, keeping my mouth shut and my eyes on her. The neighbors were starting to peek out now, their faces popping up in windows like little shadows. Curtains twitched, and I could hear soft whispers floating across the street. They'd all had their own battles with Karen before. Mrs. Lopez next door once got a fine because her grass was a tiny bit too long, like, so small you'd need a ruler to see it. Mr. Jenkins across the street told me Karen yelled at him for leaving his trash can out 10 minutes past pickup time. And the kids down the block? They said she scolded them for riding bikes too fast. Everyone on Pinewood Lane knew Karen was the bossy queen of the HOA, and they'd all felt her sting. She thought she was untouchable, like nobody could ever tell her no. But while Karen was pacing and yelling, I noticed something funny. Down the street, tucked under a big pine tree, there was a police car. It wasn't moving or flashing its lights or anything, just sitting there, quiet as a mouse. Weird, right? I'd seen it earlier when I was grabbing my tools from the shed, but I didn't think much of it then. Cops drive around sometimes, maybe stop for a coffee break or something. No big deal. But now, with Karen screaming about calling 911, it started to feel strange. Why was it already here? What was it doing? I didn't say a word, though. I kept that little secret to myself, my eyes flicking between Karen and that sneaky police car. Karen was too busy screeching to notice anything. She hung up her phone with a big, dramatic snap and spun around to face me. "The cops are on their way," she crowed, her voice loud and proud like she'd just won a prize. She glared at me, her eyes all squinty and mean. "You're done for, mister. They're gonna come here, tear down that ugly fence, and show you who's in charge." She crossed her arms and smirked, like she could already see me crying over my broken fence. I didn't move. I just stood there, leaning on my post, with Buster sniffing the grass next to me. And then get this, I smiled. Not a big, loud smile, just a little one, like I knew something she didn't. That smile made her mad. "What's so funny?" she snapped, stomping closer. "You think this is a joke? You think you're gonna get away with this?" I shrugged, keeping my voice nice and calm. "Just waiting, Karen," I said. "That's all." She huffed, her face turning red again. "Waiting for what?" "For the police to arrest you." "Oh, you'll see. They'll be here any second." She pointed at my fence like it was a monster. "That thing's coming down, and I'll be laughing when it does." I didn't argue. I could have told her I'd checked with the city, that my fence was 6 feet tall and totally okay. I could have waved that paper from Mrs. Carter in her face and said, "Look, I'm right." But I didn't. Why? Because I had a feeling this wasn't just about my fence anymore. That police car down the street, it was like a clue in a mystery book, sitting there all quiet and sneaky. Karen thought she'd called the cops to get me, but what if they were already here for something else? Something way juicier? I kept that thought in my head, like a secret candy I wasn't ready to share. The neighbors were getting braver now. Mrs. Lopez opened her window all the way and leaned out, her arms crossed. She didn't say anything, but she gave me a little nod, like she was on my side. Mr. Jenkins shuffled to the edge of his porch, his cane tapping the wood. "Too much noise," he grumbled, loud enough for us to hear. The kids on bikes rolled closer, their wheels squeaking as they stopped by the curb. "Is she gonna yell all day?" one of them whispered. His friend giggled. "Maybe she'll turn purple." I almost laughed at that. Karen's face was getting close to purple, she was so mad. Karen didn't care about the neighbors. She kept pacing my yard, her flip-flops kicking up tiny bits of dirt. Clip-clop, clip-clop. She waved her clipboard now, like it was a magic wand that could make me disappear. "I've got everything written down," she said. "Every rule you broke, every word you said, I'm showing it all to the police." I peeked at her clipboard, but I couldn't see much, just a bunch of messy scribbles. What was she writing? "Man builds fence. Dog wags tail?" It was silly, but she acted like it was super serious. Buster barked then, a happy little yip, and ran in a circle around me. He didn't get why Karen was so loud, he just thought it was playtime. "Keep that dog quiet," she shouted, jumping back like Buster was gonna bite her. I whistled, and he trotted over, plopping down by my feet. "He's fine," I said, patting his head. "Just happy." Karen rolled her eyes. "Happy? He's a nuisance, just like that fence. You're both trouble." I scratched Buster's ears and didn't say anything. She could yell all she wanted, Buster was my buddy, and I wasn't mad at him. The sun was climbing higher now, making my yard all bright and hot. Sweat trickled down my neck, but I didn't move. I stayed by my fence post, watching Karen march around like a soldier. She kept talking about how I was ruining the neighborhood, how my fence was ugly and wrong. I looked at it, just one plank so far, straight and brown. It didn't look ugly to me. It looked like the start of something good. But Karen? She saw it like a big, messy scribble on her perfect picture of Pinewood Lane. Then something happened, a little revelation, like a light bulb popping on in my head. I remembered a story Mr. Jenkins told me a few weeks ago. He'd said Karen was always collecting money for the HOA fees for fixing the street or planting flowers. But the street still had potholes, and I hadn't seen any new flowers. "Where's all that money going?" Mr. Jenkins had grumbled, shaking his head. I didn't think much of it then, just old man talk. But now, with that police car sitting there, I started to wonder. Was Karen up to something sneaky? Was that why the cops were here? I didn't say it out loud. I kept it quiet, tucked away in my brain. But it made me look at Karen different. She was yelling about my fence, sure, but maybe she had bigger problems she didn't even know about yet. I glanced at the police car again. It was still there, still quiet, like it was waiting for the perfect moment. My heart beat a little faster. This was getting good, and Karen had no clue. She stopped pacing for a second and stared at me. "Why are you so calm?" she demanded, her hands on her hips. "You should be scared. The police are coming." I shrugged again. "Not scared, Karen," I said. "Just waiting." She didn't like that. "Waiting for what?" she snapped. "For your big punishment." I smiled a tiny bit more. "Something like that," I said. I wasn't lying, I was waiting. But not for what she thought. The neighbors were whispering louder now. Mrs. Lopez called out, "Karen, maybe it's not a big deal." Karen spun around. "Not a big deal? He's breaking rules, Maria. You wouldn't understand." Mrs. Lopez shook her head and closed her window. The kids giggled again, and Mr. Jenkins tapped his cane. "Too much yelling," he shouted. Karen ignored them all. She was focused on me, her eyes like lasers. "You're gonna regret this," she said, her voice low and mean. "I promise you that." I didn't answer. I just stood there, Buster by my side, the sun shining down. The police car stayed put, silent and sneaky. Karen thought she was winning, she thought she had me trapped. But I was starting to see the pieces come together. She didn't know I'd talked to the city. She didn't know about that paper in my kitchen. And she really didn't know about the cops already being here. They weren't here for me. Oh no, they were here for something way juicier, something tied to Karen and her big, loud mouth. It was like a game now, and I was holding the best cards. Karen kept pacing, shouting about rules and police and how great she was. The neighbors watched, some annoyed, some laughing. And me? I stayed quiet, letting her dig her own hole. That police car was my little secret, a hint of something big coming her way. I could feel it, the air was buzzing, the tension growing. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about Karen, and she was about to find out she wasn't as untouchable as she thought. Karen started waving her arms again, like she was trying to fly away on all that hot air. "This neighborhood is my responsibility," she shouted, her voice bouncing off my house. "I've kept it perfect for years, and I won't let some new guy mess it up." She pointed at me again, her finger shaking. "You think you're so smart, building that fence without my permission?" I tilted my head. "Didn't need your permission, Karen," I said, calm as could be. "City said it's fine." That was like throwing water on a cat. She hissed and stepped closer. "The city doesn't run Pinewood Lane," she yelled. "I do." Buster barked at her loud voice, thinking it was playtime again. He bounced around me, his tail wagging like a windshield wiper. "Quiet, dog." Karen snapped, jumping back. I grabbed Buster's collar and pulled him close. "He's just excited," I said. "Not hurting anybody." She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might fall out. "Excited? He's loud and messy, just like you." I looked at Buster, his tongue hanging out, and smiled. "Guess we're a team then," I said. Karen didn't think that was funny. She scribbled more on her clipboard, muttering about dogs and fences and trouble. The kids on bikes were full on laughing now. "She's gonna pop," one of them said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His friend nodded. "Yeah, look at her face, purple time." They fell over giggling, their bikes tipping onto the grass. Mrs. Lopez opened her window again, shaking her head. "Karen, calm down," she called. "It's just a fence." Karen spun around so fast her flip-flops squeaked. "Just a fence? Maria, it's a violation. You'd know that if you cared about rules." Mrs. Lopez sighed and shut her window with a bang. Mr. Jenkins waved his cane. "Too loud," he shouted again. "Go home, Karen." But Karen wasn't going anywhere. She turned back to me, her eyes blazing. "See? Nobody gets it," she said. "They don't care about standards, but I do. That's why I'm in charge." She tapped her clipboard like it was proof she was the queen. I didn't say anything. I just watched her, my little smile still there. That police car down the street, it was like a shadow in the corner of my eye, quiet and waiting. Karen thought she'd called the cops on me, but I was starting to think they were here for her. And that made this whole thing way more fun. I remembered another story then, something Mrs. Lopez said once. She'd paid Karen $50 for HOA flowers, but the flower beds by the street were still empty. "Where'd my money go?" Mrs. Lopez had asked, frowning. I didn't know then, but now it clicked. Karen was always asking for money, fees for this, fees for that. But the street still had cracks, and the park bench was still broken. Was she keeping it? Was that what the police were sniffing around for? I didn't have proof, just a hunch. But it was a good hunch, and it made me watch Karen even closer. She kept pacing, her flip-flops kicking up more dirt. Clip-clop, clip-clop. "The police will be here soon," she said, smirking at me. "And when they see my notes, they'll know you're the problem." She held up her clipboard like a trophy. I squinted at it, still just scribbles, far as I could tell. "What's it say?" I asked, curious. She pulled it back quick. "None of your business," she snapped. "It's for the cops, not you." I shrugged. "Okay, Karen. Whatever you say." She didn't like that either. "Don't mock me," she yelled. "You're in big trouble, and I'm the one fixing it." The sun was hot now, making my shirt stick to my back. Buster panted next to me, his tongue out like a big pink flag. I gave him a pat and looked at the police car again. Still there, still quiet. My heart did a little jump. Something was coming, I could feel it. Karen thought she was the hunter, chasing me down with her rules and her phone. But what if she was the one being hunted? What if those cops were waiting for her, not me? It was a wild idea, but it fit. And it made me grin just a tiny bit more. Karen caught it. "Stop smiling," she shouted, stomping her foot. "What's wrong with you? You're about to lose everything." I looked at my fence, then at Buster, then back at her. "Don't think so, Karen," I said. "I'm good." She stared at me, her mouth open like a fish. "Good. Good. You're crazy. The police are coming, and you're done." I didn't argue. I just waited, letting her yell herself out. The neighbors watched, the kids laughed, and that police car sat there like a promise. Karen didn't know it, but her big day was about to get a whole lot bigger, and not in the way she wanted. The kids on bikes started cheering now, like this was a wrestling match. "Go, Karen, go," one yelled, laughing so hard he almost fell off the curb. His friend threw popcorn at him. "No, go, fence guy." Mrs. Lopez peeked out again, a little smile on her face. "You're okay, kid," she called to me. I waved back. "Thanks, Mrs. L." Karen spun around. "Maria, stop encouraging him," she shouted. "He's the bad guy here." Mrs. Lopez just laughed and closed her window again. Mr. Jenkins banged his cane on his porch. "Too much noise," he yelled. "Karen, go home. Let the boy build his fence." Karen's face went purple, really purple this time. "I'm not going anywhere, Jenkins," she screamed. "This is my street, and I say what happens." She turned to me, her eyes wild. "You hear that? My street. My rules." I nodded, nice and slow. "Sure, Karen," I said. "Your street." I wasn't agreeing, I was just keeping her going. The longer she yelled, the closer we got to whatever was coming. She paced faster, her flip-flops a blur. Clip-clop, clip-clop, clip-clop. "The police will back me up," she said. "They always do. I've called them before on noisy kids, on messy yards, and they always listen to me." She smirked again, like she was untouchable. But I remembered Mr. Jenkins' story about the money, and Mrs. Lopez's empty flower beds. Maybe the police weren't her friends this time. Maybe they'd heard something about Karen and all that cash she collected. I didn't know for sure, but it was a juicy thought, and it made me watch that police car even closer. Buster flopped down in the grass, tired of all the noise. I knelt next to him and scratched his belly. "Hang in there, bud," I whispered. "This'll be over soon." Karen saw me and snorted. "Talking to that dog again? Pathetic." I stood up, brushing dirt off my hands. He's my pal, I said. Better than some people. Her jaw dropped. What's that supposed to mean, she demanded. I shrugged. Nothing, Karen. Just waiting. She hated that word waiting. It made her stomp again, her flip-flops kicking up a little cloud of dust. The tension was thick now, like syrup on pancakes. Karen was a tornado, spinning and yelling. The neighbors were a crowd, watching and whispering. And me? I was the calm in the middle, holding my hammer and my secrets. That police car was still there, a quiet shadow under the tree. Karen thought she'd won. She thought the cops were her big finish. But I knew better. They weren't here for me. They were here for something way juicier, something tied to Karen and her clipboard and her loud, bossy ways. And it was about to get real good. The sun was high in the sky now, shining bright over my little yard on Pinewood Lane. I stood there by my fence, just one plank nailed up so far, watching Karen pace around like a mad chicken. She'd been yelling about my fence for what felt like forever, saying how the police were coming to get me. Her flip-flops went clip-clop, and her face was redder than a fire truck. She thought she was the big winner, calling 911 and telling them I was some kind of bad guy. I just leaned on my fence post, my hammer in my hand, with Buster sitting next to me, wagging his tail. I wasn't scared. I knew something she didn't. Then it happened. Minutes later, a second police car rolled up, slow and quiet. Its tires crunched on the gravel at the edge of my yard, and the blue lights on top flashed once before going dark. Karen stopped pacing and smirked, her arms crossing tight over her chest. "See? I told you," she said, her voice loud and proud. "The cops are here now, and you're in big trouble, mister." She pointed at me, then at my fence, like it was proof I'd done something awful. I didn't move. I just watched, my little smile still there, because this was about to get good. The car doors opened, and two officers stepped out. They were tall, with dark uniforms and shiny badges that glinted in the sun. Karen nodded at them, like they were her best friends coming to help her win. "Over here, officers," she called, waving her hand. "This guy's breaking all the rules with that fence." But here's the funny part: the officers didn't even look at my fence. Not once. They didn't look at me either. Instead, they walked straight toward her, their boots thumping on the grass. Karen's smirk stayed for a second, but then it started to wobble, like she wasn't so sure anymore. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice deep and serious. He stopped right in front of her, looking down at her with calm eyes. "Are you Karen Delaney?" Karen blinked fast, like she didn't hear him right. Yes," she stammered, her voice getting small. Her arms dropped to her sides, and her clipboard slipped a little in her hand. She looked at the cops, then at me, then back at the cops. "What's this about?" she asked, her loud bark turning into a tiny squeak. The officer didn't smile. He pulled out a little notebook and flipped it open. "We've been watching you, Ms. Delaney," he said. "And we've got some questions." Karen's jaw dropped so far I thought it might hit the ground. Her eyes went big, and her face turned from red to white, like all the color ran away. "Watching me," she said, her voice shaky. "What? Why? This is about him." She pointed at me again, her finger wobbling. "He's the one with the illegal fence. I called you about him." The second officer stepped closer, his hands on his belt. "Ma'am," he said, "we're not here for a fence." He raised an eyebrow and nodded at my little plank. "That's not our problem." Karen's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. She didn't know what to say, and I could tell her brain was spinning. I stayed quiet, petting Buster's head, letting this play out. Because here's the big reveal: Karen had been up to some shady stuff, and it was about to catch up with her. The first officer kept talking, his voice steady like he'd done this 100 times. "Turns out, someone tipped us off about you," he said. "For months, you've been pocketing HOA fees, hundreds of dollars that were supposed to fix the street and pay for community stuff, like picnics and flowers." Karen's eyes got even bigger, if that was possible. "What?" she yelled, her voice cracking. "That's a lie. I didn't do anything." But the officer wasn't done. "We've been watching you all morning," he said. "We parked down the street, checking things out, waiting for the right time. Your 911 call? It just made our job easier." Gave us a reason to come right over. He pulled out a pair of shiny handcuffs, and they clicked in his hands. Karen took a step back, her flip-flops tripping over the grass. "No, no, no," she shouted. "This is a mistake. I'm the good guy here. He's the criminal. Look at that fence." The second officer shook his head. "Ma'am, we don't care about the fence," he said. "You're under arrest for theft and fraud." He started reading her rights, like you see on TV. "You have the right to remain silent." Karen's jaw dropped again, and she started yelling over him. "Theft? Fraud? This is crazy. I didn't steal anything. I'm the HOA president. I keep this place perfect." But the cops didn't listen. They'd heard it all before, I guess. I stood there, my hammer still in my hand, watching it all go down. Buster barked once, excited by the noise, but I shushed him. "Easy, bud," I whispered. Karen kept shouting, her voice getting wilder. "You've got the wrong person," she cried. "He's the one breaking rules. Look at him just standing there, smiling like an idiot." The first officer glanced at me, then back at her. "He's not our concern," he said. "You are." Karen's face twisted up, like she couldn't believe it. She'd spent all morning yelling at me, thinking she was the big boss, calling the cops to get me in trouble. But now the tables were flipped, and she was the one in the hot seat. The neighbors were watching too. Mrs. Lopez had her window open again, her mouth open in shock. Mr. Jenkins leaned on his cane, nodding like he'd known all along. The kids on bikes cheered, throwing popcorn in the air like it was a party. The officer with the handcuffs stepped closer. "Hands behind your back, ma'am," he said. Karen shook her head fast. "No way. This isn't happening." But the cops were calm and firm. They grabbed her arms gentle but strong and clicked the handcuffs on her wrists. Click click. The sound was sharp, like the end of her big show. She kept yelling, her voice bouncing around the yard. "This is wrong. You're making a mistake. I'll sue you all." I couldn't help it. I smiled bigger now. Not because I was mean, but because it was so wild. Karen thought she'd won, smirking and crossing her arms like she was the queen. But the cops weren't here for my fence. They were here for her, for all that sneaky stuff she'd been doing. Months of taking money, hiding it away, thinking nobody would notice it all came crashing down because of one little 911 call about a fence. How funny is that? The officers started walking her to the car, one on each side. Her flip-flops dragged in the dirt, and her clipboard fell to the ground, pages fluttering like sad little birds. "You'll regret this," she shouted, twisting to look at me. "This isn't over." But it kinda was. The cops didn't care about her threats. They opened the car door, helped her in, and shut it with a thud. Karen's face pressed against the window, still yelling, but it was muffled now, like a radio turned down low. I looked at my fence, then at Buster, then at the cops driving away with Karen. The second car, the one that had been parked all morning, rolled up too, following behind. They'd been waiting for her the whole time, and I'd just been the guy with the hammer who got her to slip up. It was the best surprise ever, and I didn't even have to do anything but stand there. The police car rolled away slow and steady, its tires crunching on the gravel as it took Karen down Pinewood Lane. Her flip-flops had dragged on the pavement when the cops walked her over, her hands stuck behind her back in those shiny handcuffs. Her loud voice was gone now, just a quiet mumble through the car window. I stood by my little fence post, my hammer still in my hand, watching it all with Buster by my side. He barked once, wagging his tail like he knew something big just happened. And it did, something really big. The neighbors couldn't believe their eyes. They'd been peeking out their windows and doors all morning, watching Karen yell at me about my fence. Now, they stepped outside, their mouths open like they'd seen a magic trick. Mrs. Lopez next door clapped her hands first, a big smile on her face. "Way to go," she shouted, her voice happy and loud. Then Mr. Jenkins across the street joined in, banging his cane on his porch and clapping too. "Good riddance," he yelled, his grumpy face turning into a grin. The kids on bikes cheered even louder, jumping up and down like it was a party. One of them threw popcorn in the air, and it rained down like confetti. I looked around at everyone clapping and smiling, and I felt pretty good. Karen had been the bossy queen of Pinewood Lane for years, telling people what to do and making them scared of her clipboard. She thought she was untouchable, like nobody could stop her. But now, she was in a police car, heading off to answer for all that sneaky money stuff she'd done. Turns out, she'd been taking HOA fees money we all gave her for fixing the street and throwing fun events and keeping it for herself. Hundreds of dollars. The cops found out because someone told them, and they'd been watching her all morning. My fence? It was just the thing that made her trip up. I turned back to my yard and looked at my fence, or what was left of it. Just one plank so far, nailed to a post, standing tall and proud in the sun. Karen had called it ugly and illegal, but I thought it was perfect. Time to finish this, Buster, I said, scratching his ears. He barked again, his tongue hanging out, happy as could be. The police cars were gone now, disappearing around the corner with Karen inside. The street was quiet again, just the sound of birds chirping and kids laughing. It felt peaceful, like the storm had passed. That afternoon, I got back to work. I grabbed my hammer and nails, and one by one, I put up the rest of the planks. Bang, bang, bang. Each hit felt good, like I was building something strong and mine. Buster ran around the yard, sniffing the wood and chasing his tail while I worked. The sun was warm on my back, and a little breeze rustled the trees. By the time I was done, the fence looked great, 6 feet tall, just like the city said it could be, with no extra inches to make anybody mad. I stepped back and smiled. "What do you think, bud?" I asked Buster. He barked and wagged his tail, like he was saying, "Looks awesome." The neighbors came over to see it too. Mrs. Lopez walked up with a glass of lemonade for me. "Nice fence," she said, nodding. "And good job with Karen." She had it coming. I took the lemonade and grinned. "Thanks, Mrs. L. Just wanted to keep Buster safe." She laughed. "You did more than that, you shook things up." Mr. Jenkins hobbled over next, leaning on his cane. "Never liked her," he grumbled. "Always yelling, always taking my money. Glad she's gone." The kids rode their bikes by and waved. "Cool fence, mister," one shouted. "No more Karen, yay." I waved back, feeling like the hero of the day. And here's the best part, the HOA got a new leader. A few days later, we had a big meeting in Mrs. Lopez's backyard. Everyone showed up, me, Mr. Jenkins, the kids' parents, even some people I didn't know. We talked about what happened with Karen, and how she'd been sneaky with our money. Then we picked someone new to be in charge. His name was Tom, a nice guy with a big smile and a quiet voice. He lived down the street and had a little dog too, so he got why I wanted my fence. 3 extra inches, he said when someone asked about rules. No big deal. Let's just keep things easy. Everybody clapped, happy to have someone chill instead of bossy. Karen. She's not doing so great. She's still dealing with court dates, places where she has to go talk to a judge about what she did. The neighbors found out more after she left. She'd taken so much money, like, enough to fix the street and throw a big party. People were mad, and they weren't quiet about it. Mrs. Lopez said she saw Karen's car parked at her house once, but Karen didn't come out. "Probably hiding," Mr. Jenkins grumbled. "She knows we're all ticked off." The kids made up a song about her. "Karen took the cash, now she's in a flash," and sang it while riding their bikes. It was funny, but it showed how done everyone was with her. Her perfect kingdom, the one she bragged about all the time, crumbled fast. She'd spent years acting like she owned Pinewood Lane, making rules and bossing us around. She thought she could yell at me about my fence and win, like always. But she messed with the wrong guy and his dog. I didn't even have to fight her. I just built my fence, stayed calm, and let her dig her own hole. That 911 call she made? It was like a boomerang. It came right back and hit her instead of me. I sat on my porch that night, looking at my new fence. Buster was curled up next to me, snoring a little. The street was dark and quiet, with stars twinkling above. My fence stood tall, keeping Buster safe, just like I wanted. I sipped some lemonade and thought about the day, Karen yelling, the cops coming, the neighbors cheering. It was wild, but it ended right. Karen was gone, the HOA was better, and my yard was mine again. Justice was served, and it felt awesome. Okay, everybody, let's sit down and talk about what happened with Karen and my fence. It's a pretty cool story, right? And it's got a big lesson in it, a lesson that's super easy to understand, even if you're just a kid like me. So, here's the thing, sometimes, the loudest people think they've got all the power. They yell and boss everyone around, acting like they're the king or queen of the world. Karen was like that. She stomped around Pinewood Lane with her clipboard and her loud voice, telling us all what to do. She thought she was unstoppable, like nobody could ever say no to her. But guess what? She was wrong, super wrong. Then there's the quiet ones like me. I didn't yell back at Karen. I didn't stomp my feet or wave my hammer in her face. I just kept doing my thing, building my fence for Buster, staying calm even when she called the cops. I didn't need to be loud to win. I just needed to be smart and patient. And in the end, as some people say, the quiet ones came out on top. Karen's big, noisy kingdom fell apart, and I got to finish my fence and keep my yard. Pretty awesome, huh? So, here's a tip for you, something you can use at school, at home, or anywhere. Next time someone tries to boss you around, don't get mad or yell back. Just smile like I did and let them dig their own hole. What does that mean? It means let them keep talking and acting big, because sometimes that's how they mess up. Karen dug her hole by calling the cops, thinking she'd get me in trouble. But that call? It bounced right back and got her instead. She didn't see it coming, but I did, and I just waited for it to happen. You can do that too. Be the quiet one who watches and waits, and you'll be surprised how things turn out. And here's the best part, karma's always watching. What's karma? It's like an invisible friend who makes sure people get what they deserve. If you're nice and fair, karma gives you good stuff like my finished fence and a peaceful yard. But if you're mean and sneaky, like Karen stealing all that HOA money, karma comes knocking with a big surprise like cops and handcuffs. It's not magic or anything spooky. It's just how life works sometimes. Do good, get good. Do bad, watch out. I think about that day a lot now, sitting on my porch with Buster snoozing next to me. Karen was so loud, so sure she'd win. She pointed at my fence and called me a rule breaker, but she was the real troublemaker all along. And me? I just kept hammering my nails bang, 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 and let her figure it out the hard way. It makes me smile, because it shows you don't need to shout to be strong. You can be quiet and still come out on top. That's a pretty cool superpower, don't you think? So, what do you think? Did Karen get what she deserved? I say yes. She bossed everyone around for years, taking money and making silly rules, and finally, it caught up with her. The cops took her away, and Pinewood Lane got a new start with a nice guy named Tom running the HOA. My fence is still standing, Buster's happy, and the neighbors are clapping instead of hiding. It feels fair, like the good guys won. But I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, do you think Karen learned her lesson? Or do you think she's still mad somewhere, plotting with her clipboard? And hey, while you're at it, tell me your own stories. Have you ever met someone like Karen, someone all loud and bossy who thought they were in charge? Maybe a kid at school who tells everyone what to do, or an adult who acts like they own the place. What happened? Did they get a big surprise like Karen did, or did you find a quiet way to win? I love hearing stories, and I bet you've got some good ones. This whole thing with Karen and my fence, it's like a little adventure that taught me something big. Being loud doesn't make you right. Being sneaky doesn't make you smart. And being mean? That'll come back to bite you, every time. So, be the quiet one who keeps going, who does the right thing even when it's hard. Smile when someone's yelling at you, and trust that karma's got your back. It worked for me, and it can work for you too. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild tale. I had fun telling it, and I hope you had fun reading it. My fence is done, Buster's safe, and Pinewood Lane is a happier place. Next time someone tries to boss me around, I'll just grin and keep doing my thing because now I know how it ends. See you in the next one, friends. Tell me your thoughts, and let's keep the stories coming.